Towards the end, you will also have a turn to ask a couple questions, and you will have an opportunity to give a closing statement if you wish. Choosing our next superintendent is a responsibility of critical importance to the board. We know that being a superintendent of a K-12 public school district is an enormous and unique job. We need to find the right person for this moment and the future to lead our district. We are ready and excited to learn as much as we can about you during this interview process. The board has appreciated the input of staff and community in this process, so let's get started. While we have had an opportunity to review your application, our audience has not. Would you briefly review your background and what causes you to be interested in this position at this point in your career?
Sure. I have about a third of my career has been at the cabinet level, starting out as a licensed school business official when I was working for after University of Michigan, where I spent some time, about 10 years there in terms of in the finance area. I left and I went to the Interim School District in the Lansing area. I was assistant superintendent for business and finance there. I was fortunate to have an intermediate school district that was obviously involved in a great deal with training teachers, principals, superintendents. And I was fortunate to be expected to really know the business. And so I was invited to participate in as much training as I wanted. So I went to teacher training and principal training and superintendent training, who I worked with a great deal. Fell in love with it and then wanted to be a superintendent. So the local constituent superintendents at that time that we served, encouraged me to pursue that, and I never looked back. So it's something that I really love. I believe all kids can learn. Again, I spent about a third of my time, kind of in the administration of support role at cabinet level. So I went from the Ingham Intermediate School District to Southfield. So I went to University of Michigan to the Ingham Intermediate School District, 5 years, before 14 years there. 5 years at Southfield as an associate superintendent, and then I landed my first superintendency was the superintendent East and Upper Peninsula in the ISD, serving about 12 constituent districts spread out, one of the largest geographic areas to serve. Districts as small as Mackinac Island, 70 to the Sioux at the time was 3,000 students. And again, we were training them. And then I got an invite to apply for the Traverse City Area Public Schools. And that was one of my best experiences. But it was a difficult experience because we were a low-funded school district. As an example, when I worked in Southfield for $10,000 and I worked in Traverse City for $10,000, I had $42 million more to spend in Southfield than I did in Traverse City. And I was instrumental in terms of reinstating the 2X formula that originally was implemented with Proposal A. But then when I took an early retirement in Traverse City because I was closing schools, seeking pay concessions, and the state was trying to lower their financial load. And so they offered a retirement incentive trying to get staff to turn over. And I had no intention of retiring, but I was going to go out of state. So then I pursued my career. Actually, I went back to school, got my educational specialist. But I wanted to really lead something even larger at the time. But then I started renewed a career in Wisconsin, in terms of a charter school president. And then, I had Montello, small one school district. Manitowoc School District of about 5,000 students, and then I ended last year, end of last school year, as an interim superintendent for 1 year during the transition period, helping them get reestablished at Bristol. And then my wife saying, when are we coming back? Why don't you come back to Michigan so we can be closer to our kids and grandkids? And that's when I took the early retirement incentive, I could only make a third of what I was making. They lifted that. So I can come back and I can work in Michigan and just a great time. So I have 5 years. I still, my goal is to help leave a legacy of demonstrating that I can take a school district with the team, to even higher levels. And so that's my ambition, in terms of, giving back and demonstrating that all kids can learn, whether or not it's gifted and talented or an at-risk student or in between, what we can do to help kids excel and achieve.
Thank you. I'm going to be your next question. What do you know about our school district, and can you tell us what you believe are the most immediate challenges that we face?
Well, anytime you're hiring a superintendent, it's a major transition. So superintendent, transitions are important, but in terms of looking at your background, you've had community support, You have 3 bond issues here in a relatively reasonable period of time. I believe you're a low-funded school district, so some of the things I experienced at Traverse City are here also. But just looking in terms of what you put on your bulletin, in terms of what you're looking for and stuff like this, was really attractive in terms of excellence and some of the statements of every student every day. Those things just resonate with me in terms of there's a commitment both for your faculty and staff, as well as what they will do then to help our teachers succeed and excel.
So what did you say were like the challenges you specifically?
Well, challenges in there, for example, if everybody is looking at us now and kind of grading us, and I think, I was looking in terms of where do you stand in the Grand Rapids area, okay? And I believe you're underachieving. I think you have capacity from what I understand and what you've stated on paper and what I've been able to research in terms of you've got quality staff. You have the capacity to take it to the next level. And I think one of your challenges is obviously with your financial resources to demonstrate that that's possible. And I've done that, when I say I've done that, it's always been with a team, with teachers at the center. That there are ways that you reach higher, but it takes really pulling people together and really focusing in terms of what is it, that we're missing here. And so I'm big in terms of not reinventing the wheel and going out to say, how are others doing that, so that we have some comparisons, a little bit more than your curriculum review cycle. I really want to compete with the best. And what I loved about Traverse City was I put them in that ballpark, and yet we weren't failing, some kids, but they were hiding our success. So we had about 13 elementary schools at the time, and 3 of them were more transitory. And I had a major structural deficit that we had to deal with. And at the same time, I recognized we had to even add more programming because we were not doing some things we needed to do for all kids to excel. And so I think you have that kind of a dynamics in terms of here. You have a lot of capacity to take it to the next level. And I believe you're looking for that person that energizes the team, that really demonstrates, okay, how do we do this? How do we leverage resources better? How do we get a greater return? So what's working, what's not working. So that's a little bit where I'm at in terms of what little you can do in terms of outside of the region, to make that assessment.
Could you describe your typical style of leading and talk about situations in which you might vary from that style?
That's a great question. I'm a person, in terms of believe very strongly in terms of seek first to understand and to be understood. Okay, I've been fortunate to play college football at Central Michigan University, so the team is always important. That it takes the team, really to win. But what I really believe strongly in is increasing the capacity of people to do more, and that means they really know what everybody is looking and expecting to do individually and collectively, just as you might look at the sports, okay? But it's in distributed leadership. If we all know what we're doing and we know our roles, then it takes less supervision, because everybody's on the same page or in the same boat rowing, with all oars, synchronized and going forward. Now, I would also say, though, that it could be situational. I was hired in Manitowoc in Wisconsin as an interim because their superintendent was on his way out. And so when I went in there, they really wanted me to stabilize it and tee it up for the next superintendent. Well, we were doing so well that they made me the permanent superintendent within 6 months. But there was a situational analysis was we were at one time a very destination point community and school district, great economy, aluminum, boat making, Manitowoc, so the economy was booming, and they created some of the state-of-the-art facilities that they came across the country. All the AP classes you might want, people would come to see what they were doing. When I took over, 70% of our kids were not reading at grade level or doing math at grade level. They had totally lost it. And I was instrumental in terms of getting that team to, and it required some changes, but to get them to recognize that this is unacceptable. And everybody agreed, but they got into incremental achievement was okay. Well, that was my son. That wouldn't be acceptable if it was in your school. I would expect more. And we took that on, and we started setting the stage for that. That was not an easy thing. So we had to make some tough decisions at that time. So it was a little bit, again, it's still very important that you have ownership. But, sometimes if your house is on fire, you're not going to form a committee to figure out, well, how should we put the fire out? Hopefully you're already trained and know what you do first. So sometimes I think you have to assess where you're at. Student safety is always the first. At some point in time, you will stop everything to make sure you might be addressing a concern there. You're welcome.
How would you go about evaluating the effectiveness of the curriculum, assessments, and teaching methods in the district?
Well, one of the things that I believe very strongly of, and sometimes I don't know that we convey that in our actions, but this is a profession, and I love the profession. So faculty have to be deeply involved. But I would also say that you also have to have a good understanding of research. And sometimes what's happened over the years is we've gotten a little lax in terms of really questioning and digging deep, to make sure we really truly understand and evaluate certain curriculums. As a case in point, a major flaw, that hit schools was the adoption of Lucy Calkins' reading material. There's good stuff in that, but we were just accepting, in terms of people who were reading, in terms of here's the newest thing we need to do, and the kids just love to read, it's going to be fine, we're throwing out phonics and doing some other things. And so we're jumping on theories without seeing and knowing that it was tested and proven that would give you the return. So I'm always looking for what's the evidence. And quite often you have to be careful of your, you have now associations, that are rating curriculums. That's flawed, in terms of it's not the whole truth. And that's where going back to school, actually, after I took that early retirement, went back to school, I just really enjoyed the research part of it. And more made sense in terms of, at first I just couldn't eat up enough. Tell me more in terms of what do we know that will make a difference without really questioning where's the evidence behind that. So I'm very big in terms of what's the data, what's the evidence behind something, to be able to validate that. But this is a collective decision, that should formulate itself, through your faculty in the lead role, working with your instructional leaders, principals and others, to really be able to come and advance that for board consideration. And I believe very strongly that parents and community should be also aware. You should have a review cycle of your curriculum, you should have it posted, and I would think you should do everything possible to make sure that it's really clear in terms of what we're teaching and how we're doing it, so that, the transparency and visibility just builds support.
Tell us about a time that you disagreed with a stakeholder's view on an issue, but still showed empathy and understanding to come to a resolution that was workable.
Well, this was a tough one. This goes back at Manitowoc, and again, whenever you have a strong division, it's very difficult sometimes, to be able to navigate those waters. But I came post-COVID, okay, so I was kind of in the recovery stages of helping that district, and I made reference to the grades. But we were a low-funded school district, similar to the Traverse City. I, helped pass one of their highest operating referendums that they've ever had, and that was because I brought both sides of the table together and helped them understand it was a revenue problem, not a spending problem. However, that efficiency, which was driving me a little bit in terms of looking any place in terms of to prevent a future problem or to correct a problem that might be financial, when COVID came in, we were providing free lunches to all. And there was a lot of people who said we just should continue to do this, even though there are parents that can afford to pay for some kids. Some kids, obviously, we want to help them. We want to not have anybody know about that, but to be able to make that provision. I went back and went back to only doing it for those qualified. Okay, knowing that there are always going to be some people who their parents might be able to afford that, but there's needs in that family. and we're going to help those families out because we find out about them, okay? Well, because of the controversy in the community, that was an area that they could attack. And so there's all kinds of news stories about them not feeding kids, from impoverished homes and stuff like this. It was false information, and yet it was the focus of our attention. And I'm a proponent of keeping the main thing the main thing. We're here to help kids, academically and socially achieve. And all of a sudden, this is such a distraction. And my board was, quite supportive of it until that. And I suggested we do free lunch. Even though I knew at some point in time the federal government pushed that cost back on you, and then you're making choices about, are we going to do this or are we going to support classroom instruction? But it was a case where I proceeded knowing in terms of what was most reasonable and sensible from a financial standpoint with my background to know, even though it was for the wrong reasons being used against me, I had to let go of that. And we reinstated it, and we moved on. But that was a very challenging one. What I would have done different, I had the authority to make that decision. I should have recognized it could be a controversial issue. And I should have brought more discussion maybe to the board and the community. And even let the board, say, this is my recommendation. Do you want to proceed with that, even though I had authority to do that?
Okay. What are the key practices needed to establish and maintain a good working relationship with and among the board?
I think, I've been pretty fortunate because most of my career has been at the board level. About 10 years as an assistant and 20 years or so knowing from committee work to everything else. Trust is critically important, establishing that credibility, and a lot of that comes with communications. And sometimes I've read so much about board governance, that it's kind of taken a full circle where more board members want to be more involved, and that doesn't mean in the weeds. They just recognize the importance of their decisions, and they really truly need to have that understanding. But I believe, more information is better than not. And I hear a lot of conversations where people start falling into this camp, this is my lane, this is your lane. This is a team. And I'm a non-voting member of the governance team. And some of the things that I do to create, that trust is I really try to know individually each board member, but in terms of sharing information, it's always collectively. No, I don't want any board member feeling giving something to one board member and not the other. But I truly want to make sure that I'm communicating and connecting individually and collectively with you.
Thank you. Describe the extent of your experience with budget development, financial management, and district operations inclusive of any financial expenditures.
I've always been, because I was a licensed business official, I've always been involved in passing and, for the most part, a good record successfully, of doing that. Budget, I've done everything from zero-based budgeting, which I would never do again because the time we put into that didn't give it a return, even though our welding lab knew, I knew how many rods they were expecting, to order, but I consumed a great deal of time, even though it was beneficial for everybody. That didn't really give you a return, So I believe you have to, and most of your money is still in salaries and benefits. I mean, that's where you're spending the majority of it. But it's also in terms of, through a distributed leadership model, you want ownership and you want understanding. So I spend a lot of time making sure that people really do understand the budget. They understand it from various dimensions, from what does it impact me in a classroom teacher, as a principal with a building, or collectively. And that same thing goes with the board. So, one of the things I did in Traverse City was that high achieving, competing with the best of the best. And they were kicking the financial problems that we had down the road. And, I finally said, we need to get all the stakeholders involved. And it was a pretty elaborate process. We ended up closing some schools. But the other thing we were serious about doing was to recognize we still weren't teaching all kids well. And that's where we added all day, every day kindergarten. So here we need to cut the budget, and I'm saying we need to add certain things. At the same time with that, we had public forums of 400 people. And it was very difficult closing schools. It's very difficult, but that whole community, some really wanted to close more. The outcome of that, the success of that, probably earned me the Michigan Association of Public Relations Officers named me Superintendent of the Year. And a lot of that was because of going through all that conflict about engaging people. And the one school that we closed was named Birth of Boss, and we just happened to have the governor's convention in Traverse City, and all these signs were up, and we were sued from that. They didn't, win, but it was unfortunate. But it was like, say, Birth of Boss, and everybody thought it was somebody who was ill. What was important there, I probably spent more time in that school up to and after that decision was made than any other school, because they needed to heal. And I probably had more supporters afterwards from that school. And what we did was actually put an addition onto another school, so all those families could stay together. So sometimes it's working compromise, to make sure you try to get into a win-win situation. Very difficult. You tell people, you beat them over the head in terms of how involved they should be with the schools, and you go and close one. That's a slap in the face, right? But you have to understand their perspective and where they're coming from. And I could give you other examples, with other school districts that I have, so if you would want more information.
How will you invest time and engage with the community to ensure that your work aligns with the overall values of our schools and community?
Well, again, it goes back to one of my opening statements: seek first to understand and to be understood, and you don't do that behind a desk. What's really nice, for example, my last assignment was a one-school campus, and it was just, I was in every classroom, I walked every hall, every day. I couldn't do that in Traverse City. I had to trust. 3,000 students, this is ideal. You can do so much of both. Obviously you want everybody doing that, okay? But I think, your presence is critical, because it's three things that I think are critically important. We've known this for some time: rigor, relevance, and relationships. Relationships is the door opener. If you aren't connecting with people, if people don't really understand, or they don't leave you're listening to them, understanding them, you're not going to accomplish what you'd like to accomplish. But you can have disagreement and accomplish a whole lot because you took the time out to, make sure, and when people feel like they've heard, they're valued, and you get a greater return, and it's supported them.
Thank you. I've got the next question. How do you communicate your expectations to employees? How do you deal with employees who do not meet your expectations? And can you please provide an example?
In terms of expectations, it's always important to have an understanding up front. Whether or not it's from setting goals at the board level, and breaking that all the way down, what's the expected outcome? And then it's a clear understanding through data in terms of where are we at. And then there's a reasonable agreement in terms of this is where we want to go. We all play a role in that. So it's clear expectations, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish and what each individual's role might be onto that. Now, some underlying things, I'm always going to be looking at academic performance. Are we really raising the needle, or are we going through some things we're checking boxes? So I'm always looking to make sure we get that ultimate return. We're here primarily for students to achieve and succeed. So everything for me has to go back and get tied into that. But our successes are measured in different areas, and so it's clear expectations, knowing that. Now, some things that could be negative can be really positive. We have plans of improvement. To the extent that, sometimes it's almost part of that due process. They just need more help and more structure. Shouldn't necessarily be seen as a negative, but a positive. But clearly there are times when you just have to, help people make career decisions. But when you're that open and that understanding up front, they know it before you do, that something's working or not. But in so many cases, it's more than just an individual, it's a systems problem. Because we're not impacted just by what we do, we're impacted about how everything else interfaces with our work. Whether or not it's a classroom teacher or a principal or a clerk or secretary, everybody's impacted, in terms of how the system works and touches those individuals. Did I answer that question?
Yes.
Next question. how do you learn what their strengths are? How do you learn their areas for development? How do you coach them so that they're better leaders 1 year from the day you were hired?
The same thing here in terms of it's really important for the goal. Sometimes you're getting information through other sources, okay, in terms of how large you are. Traverse City, obviously large, I got assistants who are, but it was still important to, it was really interesting. I'll give you an example in terms of when I say outreach and getting to know people and really understanding their work. When I came into Traverse City, large district, okay, 10,000 students, I'm making the rounds. I'm meeting with people, even though I'm trusting my assistant superintendents, I'm trusting principals. And all of a sudden I had some staff member somewhere, because I got a call back from Eastern Upper Peninsula ISD where I was superintendent. They got a call thinking that my assistant superintendent was only going to show me and my person is that he will know what's going on, at the end, because I'm looking for multiple sources and I'm trying to get as close as I can to how everything impacts students. And again, there's certain evidence that we collect that is also revealing, in terms of being able to provide this information, going back to setting goals in terms of budget and targets, in terms of what's the metrics for how we might measure something.
Thank you. Please describe your understanding of a well-established special education continuum of services. What would you do to ensure that such a continuum exists across all grade levels despite the financial difficulties of providing these services?
I feel like I'm very knowledgeable about special education. When I first started, and I've always enjoyed research and studying and trends, when I was at the Interim School District early in my career, special education cost was always an issue. We aren't getting enough funding, and we're sending more and more kids to special education. It was really interesting. Some people may not recognize this, but our pyramid intervention strategy, right now, originally the attempt to do that was the federal government was going to stop reimbursing schools who were putting too many kids in special education, but that was considered unlawful. Now you have your tiered interventions, in terms of coming. But I'm taking that from the top down in terms of working with, for example, a director, of special education. I've also recognized in terms of how effective those individuals need to be at the boundary. So I've done two things. I've had a general ed person who felt like any student that went into special education was the special ed director's responsibility, not his anymore. All kids remain general ed kids, and some required supplemental special education services, even though some of that could be 100%. So sometimes it's recognizing that people are working together and leveraging their collective understanding, to come up with better solutions. But I've had to actually, when I was at the Eastern Peninsula, my general ed administrator was really good, but not good enough. And I had to help him make a career decision, and I actually put my special ed director into that job. And we just excelled, because they brought both sides together, working together much more closely. At the same time, I've had a special ed director who really couldn't manage the boundary with principals and teachers. And you have to be a good boundary person. So I'm looking for those things, and sometimes it's me myself, okay? In that situation, I had to help the special ed director make a decision. And then actually what happened was I had a very interested principal who didn't have special ed experience, but we ended up training her through the ISD to become our special ed director. She was an excellent principal, then became an excellent central office. I really like developing within whenever you can. There's so much that you can leverage. Sometimes, obviously, you might want to go outside, but it's really nice when you're looking for a succession planning, because you're looking at developing everybody you can. I'd much rather lose somebody because they're so good, but you're going to get a greater return. So that's a little bit in terms of where I'm at with special education. Our only son, was speech and hearing impaired. Thank goodness, we understood that there was a procedure that helped correct some of that, but he lost so much hearing. We had tubes put in his ears, but he was reading lips. I couldn't understand them, and we got him into special education. My wife would come home crying and he graduated from the top of his class. He's a successful CEO now, doing extremely well. Nobody would ever know what he went through. I love looking at myself as an instructional leader first, even though I'm a non-traditional. I just fell in love with this profession and I couldn't learn enough about it. You may not recognize, some of the names like Madeline Hunter. She was from out west, but very significant. We were using her to help train local school district teachers and principals. I thought she was on our staff. And then also from Michigan State University. We were hand in hand, and I was absorbing all that stuff. So I have deep understanding of both of those, but I understand money touches everything too. And I've also studied, in fact, the state actually adopted this because we were using this with superintendent, it was price of government. In terms of, you really need to know what are your highest priorities and that return on that investment versus another option. And you should know that before you're ever in a financial problem. Well, most people don't, just because when things are working, you don't spend sometimes that month. But you really need to know, what would you do if you had that situation? If you don't have it, you should still know what you need to do. Sometimes that makes you more efficient because you might recognize we're not really getting a return on something. And public education, unlike businesses, don't really evaluate as much the return on investment. It's a professional, it's just like if you're looking at the medical, looking at, people healed and we want to be able to have that. But I bring that dynamic of understandings really in depth, those two things about how they work together to help us make informed decisions.
Okay, what is your approach to dealing with discussions about potentially difficult topics, such as race, religion, politics, or sexual orientation? Please provide a specific example.
That was, probably, Stephen, that was probably the greatest challenge I ever had. Well, let me back up one, okay? When I went from the Interim School District to Southfield, Southfield used to be a large Jewish community, predominantly Jewish. A lot of students, when I first came, we were trying to stop students from sneaking in from Detroit, because they weren't residents, okay? So there was really a minority issue there, because when I came in, it was a majority minority school district, even though they can still consider one high school versus the other a white high school. I worked to build that community, and I was an associate superintendent. I wasn't the superintendent. After I left in 5 years, to take my first superintendency, all of a sudden I get in the mail a proclamation of tribute from the mayor for healing that community and bringing them together. Now in Manitowoc, really divisive, and some of this is, gender identity and stuff like this, very difficult. And it starts with, policy, and the board represents the community. You're elected to do that, and I need to help you in terms of, where is the community on these issues? How do we go into this? But also, what is really the role of education versus not? So I really kind of help with those discussions about doing. But it was a very, very difficult thing. But it started with policy, to be able to change that. And the other thing I really worked hard not to do is personalize this and taking those assaults. And they were significant. It was very difficult. In fact, the board changed. The board had unseated, 3 members, because of this issue. And it was probably more of a traditional board that hired me. Did you have a question?
Yeah, can you, I didn't hear what the specific part of what you're saying, Manitowoc, like what was the
Well,
actual?
Manitowoc, there was, we had, the administration was being accused of, kind of including in their curriculum white privilege, and that was flatly denied. There was actually proof of that. As an example, we had a very, very, very strong and good math specialist. She was actually the head of the Wisconsin Teachers Math Association. And one of the curriculums, that was, for an in-service, state in-service, for them. She was suggesting how we really need to recognize our white privilege and change our curriculums. So while it was stated that it wasn't happening, it was there. And I just had to shine light to it and create some visibility, even though there was division on it. It was not an easy thing. But, some of that is now, I think, in perspective. I don't think it's been totally healed. There's still some things that come around there, but, you can't ignore it. If these issues are there, they need to be addressed. And again, I think we go back to what's the board's primary responsibility is a policy. You're representing this community. Where is this community? There could be differences in different areas, and I respect that. No matter what my feelings personally might be. And here's another thing. For example, what I did and created a strong reaction, but people are trained on this stuff. I had specialists who were trained to create safe spaces. To me, if I made a statement that you had to go here to be safe, that school wasn't safe. It made no sense to me. But I wasn't afraid to be into that conversation, but it was a very difficult one. In terms of how you might get painted, how you looked at that. But, a lot of specific examples of the free and reduced. I mean, it was because of this association that other things just got dragged into it. And that's where I recognize you have to be careful because ultimately, and what I used to say, the big driver of helping people move from that, keep the main thing the main thing. How's academic instruction happening in the classroom? And again, let's look at, and then get into specific examples. Who is somebody being bullied or whatever, because that's unacceptable. No child should be bullied or anything, and no teacher should be disrespected. It starts getting back into, and what are your guidelines for that? We had a significant behavior issue, and a lot of that was because of restorative justice. We're learning more. Did that work? But there's always some good in what we're doing, but you really have to look at what that return is. I've had more, when I went into Manawak, the other thing, what happened there was that retired teachers came out to help with the committee with some board members to study this because administration wasn't doing anything because of behavior in the classroom. And they were trying to bring back in terms of, reasonable things in terms of, how do we discipline, how do we manage this, how do we help kids, but that we create, safe environments. So I've had a great deal of experience with a lot of controversy. But I've also recognized that sometimes we might challenge or argue a situation without all deep understanding. And this, again, it goes back to seeking first to understand and to be understood. Because as I start researching this, we act sometimes because we think we know what the other people are saying or totally what it means. And sometimes we don't. And sometimes where we think we might have disagreement, we might actually have agreement. Did that clarify?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. One thing we focus on is a well-rounded student and the profile of a student, which includes extracurricular activities such as athletics, choir, drama, etc. How specifically, from the seat of the superintendent, would you go about supporting kids getting more involved in school-sponsored activities and building that sense of school pride?
This is critically important for me. I was fortunate through sports. I don't know that I'd be here today if it wasn't for what I was able to do, through sports and what I learned from that, and then how important that made the whole school experience. And I've had, and so the fine and performing arts. I mean, one of the things that I like about the at least 3,000 student per system is you offer a comprehensive school system. And all these things are important. When I went into Traverse City, they recognized that they had not been dealing with their financial situation. We had people going over to Europe every other year, to be able to perform. We were that good. And then at the time, Governor Granholm was implementing new graduation requirements. And we were stuck. And I had all the chairs of, all the fine and performing arts, came and asked to meet with me because they were afraid I was going to cut that. And we didn't cut it at all. In fact, one of the ways that we were able to manage the budget, to not lose those offerings, is we went from semester to trimester. So in some ways, I've been referred to as a fixer. It's almost looking for there's other opportunities there. We've got to be just careful we don't wring your hands and you start lamenting over that. You really work together to start exploring options and do it. But I feel very strongly about that. I had experience, and I wouldn't say that this is good or bad, but when I was in Southwood, we implemented academies. So we had engineering and schools in the schools. We had 2 comprehensive high schools, but we also had done something for the arts. We we had dropouts that were at the verge of dropping out that excelled in that area because we provided that offering. So I'm recognizing there's gifts and talents that kids have. And I think we also have to recognize not only can something complement something, it might be the avenue of their future, their career, their success, their happiness.
Please share with us strategies you use to ensure staff members feel valued and appreciated.
Well, the one thing I think is relationships. And again, by sitting behind the desk, and doing things that doesn't touch, have that contact is the first thing, so I think that presence, and I would extend this from staff to parents, again, I'll use Manitowoc because it's fairly recent. What our PTAs were in our schools, we had we have 6 elementary schools, a person, an assistant maybe. So I had, I formed a PTA committee, and I had all the presidents meet with me on a monthly basis so we could brainstorm together about how to get parents, back involved. Okay. Well, it's the same thing with teachers, and I made reference. I like to develop within. I look for opportunities. How do you become an administrator, without experience? So we looked in terms of how could we do something that we might give them a little bit supplemental, or maybe not, but just the opportunity for them to put something on their resume that they had this experience doing something they may not otherwise have. So there's so many different ways that you might be able to do that. But professional learning communities. Again, your that distributed leadership model. You have a way of connecting and tapping in. But I also think you have to always roll things up, and you shouldn't do that just at the end of the year. So for example, when our Manitowoc, we put a thing together. We had quarterly reviews, and principals and select staff teachers would come with them to present in terms of how are we doing on the comprehensive system for improvement. So there's a lot of ownership and a lot of sharing. And that opens up invitations, in terms of where they want you out that much more at their building or whatever.
Thank you. How do you know what to communicate to the community and when to communicate it?
Well, there's some of the things that we've done is we've used certain services, where we get feedback from teachers, students, and parents. That's the first thing. The second, for that very reason, I started the PTO thing because there were an arm of information. And I also did it for special ed parents. I didn't feel like we were really communicating with the special education parents. So you can create opportunities, in terms of making sure that you really understand. I remember we were lost when our son needed, we didn't know any place, in terms of where to go. And it's amazing what happens when people who have a need, whether or not it's staff or students, and they start seeing resources because you're helping them connect with that. So, going back to, and you're setting goals, so I try to create as much visibility as possible. I mean, right now the state did it too. You have to require some things and pull some things. Every school district does, in terms of trying to say, these are always things. We're just going to say we're putting them out there always, consistently, so that people can not be surprised by something, and then maybe be a little bit more direct. You have, situations that get reported also through the board or whatever, and there's always follow-up to that. So there's a number of avenues, in terms of where I think you can, create opportunities to elevate that voice and gain them that appreciation and respectful exchange, in terms of working together because you're taking the time out to really understand. Going back to seek first understand, then to be understood.
Next question, please give us examples of educational change or reform that you have initiated that improves success for all students. And I'm sorry, I recognize that's a little redundant from what you
Yeah,
said.
well, I'll give you, one of the things that I wanted to do after Traverse City is I was really wanting to take on a large urban school district. And you probably don't know the size of some schools. Traverse City was 10,000. I was the runner-up in Kenowa, didn't get it. that was 20,000 plus. I was out at a runner-up for East New York, 20,000 plus. Reynolds, Oregon, butts up to Portland, runner-up, didn't get the job. And my search consultant said, there's a historically significant charter school in Milwaukee. You've got this thing that you want to prove that all kids can learn. And so I researched them, and it was one of the first choice schools in Milwaukee. All that started in Minnesota. It used to be a Catholic school, a parochial school. And the nuns and some business leaders said, we're not going to lose this. And so they started choice. Eventually it went to charter. We had 17 people on the board. It was who's who in Milwaukee, in terms of when I was coming in. It was the last of 5 that started, at the time that was still significant, was called Early Day School. I had 3 board members who were faculty on Marquette University, University of Wisconsin, and I forgot the other one in the Milwaukee area. But they selected a whole school reform curriculum developed out of Johns Hopkins University with the name Success for All. That was so powerful. Now, I also recognize that they were significant as a Head Start program. We had 2 campuses, and we had about 300 to 400 in our Head Start program, but we weren't a direct recipient. We were subcontracted for our funds. Federal government was causing everybody they were requiring everybody to reapply for that. There's no guarantees that anybody who had that would get it. Well, when I was looking at it, my board already had an application, a grant proposal in, because we were knocking it out of the park, and they were sure we were going to get it. So because of their adoption of Success for All curriculum that I really truly understand, and what they were planning to do for early childhood, through Head Start, I decided to go. Well, and then, coming off of Traverse City and closing schools, I was really excited about, okay, if I can't do an urban, I'll start a charter school chain, and we'll perfect this. Well, we didn't get the grant. That's okay, because we called the fallback method. End of the year, what happened? The feds pulled their grant. I'm consolidating 2 campuses, lost the Head Start, closing the program down. But I found another provider, and I reestablished it. We had 1 year because of Common Core and controversy over that, they didn't have a state report card. Our report card when I went in was meets due expectations. After trying to consolidate and stay alive, I'm cutting everything. Okay, I'm cutting security. You don't do that in Milwaukee. I'm cutting security, and the board's trying to make a decision. I got a renewal on our charter from the University of Wisconsin, and our last report card now is Feil's report card. My competitor, who is another charter school, not Milwaukee Public Schools, but another charter school, was bringing in $4,000 more per pupil. I couldn't, but they were knocking it out of the park. I knew I could beat him, okay? So what we did, because I had this curriculum, my principal, the board, asked me in terms of, can we make enough gain to increase our philanthropic support? And I said, my metrics suggest we're going to do this. I just can't tell you how much this next year. Well, we made the decision to close because we didn't want to not make a payroll or to lose our charter. So we're closing. Next year the report comes out. We went from fails to meet expectations to within less than 2 points to significantly exceeds expectations, the 8th highest scoring K-8 in the area. Very sweet. But that's, just, an example, relative to that. Did I answer the question? Very more around to that.
Would you share with us an emergency or difficult situation you had to deal with? Who did you involve, and what was the outcome?
Well, an emergency, situation, I had, a few, I was at Montello, and I'm leaving early. I had an appointment to get some car work done, but I was going, back to Michigan. And we had a call that a student had overdosed, in the bathroom, after school. That's the first priority. So everything stops. I'm back, in terms of. But the best thing to do regarding an emergency is whatever you can do to prepare for that when that happens, or to avoid it. So we do have, significant procedures in place, and so that's always one of the things in terms of making sure you have the information, or you have an action plan already in place in terms of how to deal with some of those things. But sometimes you're not going to be able to plan for everything. But security is getting better, even though there's a cost associated. In my last one, I came in, they had passed a referendum in Wisconsin. It was Bristol. They had face recognition. I mean, we were able to prevent so much from what we had there. We had accusations of staff and staff issues, which we said, no, there's no evidence of that, to kids, to police coming to use our recognition and get license plates, so much have changed, so for me, it's always more, what can you do to prevent that? But you always have to think what's priority, and your priority first is students. And that's why we have plans in place. What happens if we have to evacuate, the school? I've had, bomb threats and stuff like this, and, quite often they weren't true. But, so much of that is putting yourself in a ready state, to be able to handle that. I've always been very close with law enforcement, all the various people who play a role. Even though we still act for the school, nobody else does. But their partnerships, can be very valuable in terms of how you work together, and typically you're going to end up with a better outcome by doing that. So it's not necessarily direct extra, but that's one. I've had other situations that have been emergency, and I can tell you that I've always said you need to be in a ready state. Okay, and it just happened in Southfield here. I've got racial issues, with the white high school and the other school that is considered African American. They're both African American primarily. And the bleachers really needed to be changed, and I got a new facilities person, and I'm pushing him to be in a ready state, so he's thinking I'll be in a ready state, so he disassembles the bleachers. So there's a lumen shortage, and we really didn't know that everything was online, so I recognized the importance of planning. There was a misplan. So you have to just bring all your people together. We got the principals together. We had to play at the white high school, which wasn't, but you're going to have to do whatever you have to do to continue to make things work for kids and staff and parents. So the answer is fail to plan to fail. So we have to think of these things before they happen, and we go through drills and experiences that could be valuable for us.
If you strongly believe that there need to be changes to systems or structure, what steps would you take? And do you have an example of reworking systems or structure to make them better?
Well, I gave you some examples, already. So one of the things that's clear is you can't keep that to yourself, and what you don't want to do is reactionary. So as soon as you know of something, you have to get stakeholders involved. You have to elevate that level of understanding. I went into Manlock. We had a literacy problem. We had a math problem. And we weren't really, and I got the community, so that they were aware of it. And that was very difficult because people felt like, oh, you're saying we did that stuff. No, we just, you can't do anything about the past. It's what you're doing today and moving forward. But, I could pull different examples. I'll just give you another one in Bristol. The administration there, came in, the administrators were on sick leave, then went on administrative leave. And they were going for a referendum, millage, and you had to get operating millage, or you can't with proposal A, here, now. But they were seeking more money, which most schools, a lot of schools do in Wisconsin. But he had also loaded up in terms of putting more directors at central office. We're a small district of 600 some students. You don't put that type of administration in. So I'm coming in, and first of all, he made a claim that we'll be laying off everybody. Well, they didn't lay off anybody when the millage fell, And so when I came in there and I helped them, I actually reduced some of that central. And there could be a need, somewhere, down the point in time. But it's really educating people, no matter what it is. What's the evidence behind what you do? Don't personalize anything. Don't overreact to it. Just start putting some things on the table, but be also aware of the sensitivity of an issue, in terms of how you approach that boundary.
In your current position, how much time
extremely valuable. Bristol, the smaller you are, the more you could do. But, this is both inside and out of the school district. There was a division in Bristol, but that was way different than in Manitowoc. That was more of a financial thing and overextending the finances, okay? But, the first thing I did was, I tried to figure out how can I get close with the teachers, and so I started meeting with the grade level teams. The same thing in Traverse City I mentioned in terms of going out, it takes a little bit longer. You're working through other people, but you're also looking to establish that relationship and seek that evidence yourself, from firsthand. So, I would, the return is great. Traverse City, Upper Peninsula, I met with the tribes because they're a significant part of the community. So I meet with all those. I always would be on a service organization, whether or not it's Kiwanis or Rotary. And I would take every opportunity I could to present, and I've always been totally available to the press. Because I think that transparency, and we're really losing, this sometimes, when we seem to be trying to hide something. And we're really not, we're just busy. Some of this stuff is just really challenging work, a lot of press, a lot of stress. But I found the more open you are about that, through experience, you're careful in terms of how you manage conversations. But I felt, here it is. Sometimes the more controversy, it's a little bit harder, and it might be, wanting to try to create some type of a storyline. But in Traverse City, people used to call it the Wretched Eagle. I had no problems with Traverse City until I started closing schools and seeking pay concessions. And then all of a sudden we used to say, am I, above the fold or below the fold, because I was creating news. But just work to manage it. I meet with the editorial board. So I think outreach is critically important, particularly in this role. I was on the Economic Development Council in the Upper Peninsula in one of the counties because we were losing students. And we couldn't just sit back and not try to understand how can we help. Part of it was the economy. What could we do? I had the first Tri-County Economic Development Summit. And at first they never would think of doing that because that was in Sault Ste. Marie, the largest county. It was like, we don't want to do what they used to. And I had to help them understand anybody who wins in the Upper Peninsula wins for all. But I'm sharing you different examples, in terms of just some of my experiences and what I've been able to do because of, how you look at some things.
As the school superintendent, what do you feel are the most, are your most important responsibilities?
Safety, student safety, staff safety is absolutely critical. It's a prerequisite. We shouldn't have schools we can't. And we recognize, that nothing's 100%. But we've gotten so much better, at that. So that's really important. The next thing is developing relationships. It's a team. In terms of people really, need to feel part of what that is. Because you untap all this capacity, this potential when somebody feels like, yeah, I might not be a starter, but might get in. It's like I'm in a ready place. It's how we treat people and respect people and how we do that. And I'm always concerned in terms of the focus should not be at central office or, administration. It should be what's happening in our classroom. Should be the major focus. Keep the main thing the main thing. Teachers are the highest priority relative to, it's the instructional core where learning takes place. And that's curriculum, students, and teachers. And that's where everything should evolve. And you need organizational coherence. And I will say that time and time, keep the main thing the main thing. It's all about teaching and learning. That's why we're here. That's our business.
This is our last question. What has been the most unpopular administrative decision you've had to make? And how did you handle the reaction to this decision?
Did I talk about school lunch yet?
Yeah. I know, as I'm asking this question.
The second one was the reality of telling a high-performing school district that they're no longer high-performing and they're actually failing kids. And that was, probably the most challenging, difficult, with the most fall. And there's so much other stuff that got mixed into that. We weren't keeping the main thing, even though I think I really helped get that. There slide back. There always is sometimes that, if you don't have a sustainable board, that really can help, take things over the finish line. But those are probably there are more examples, but those are probably the most two that were recently really challenging.
Do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, I would want to know from your perspective, what is the probably the single most important thing you'd like to see a new superintendent do? So if you're prioritizing all the things that we've been talking about here,
So
from your lens,
I don't know about the most important thing, but accountability is something that we talk a lot about at this table, holding people accountable, doing what, walking the walk, talking the talk.
and I think that that's critically important, and I would, quite often that is seen as a negative, instead of a positive. And really you can flip that and make that a positive, where everybody wants it, and then you start, kind of saying, how are we, it's almost looking at the United Way, thermometer in terms of how are we doing and raising that, when you can start celebrating your successes because you're actually looking at some things that show that you are accountable, can really be beneficial. So the other thing that I would suggest is an opportunity, to provide a little bit more there is how we frame things. You frame things in a positive, you're likely to get more return. You frame it in a negative, it sets the stage for that's how that is going to be viewed and discussed. The next thing I would say, what does success look like in a year or 5 years, unless somebody else had something else that they might want to share with, I'm looking for fit and stuff like this in terms of, whether or not I'm reading the board.
You had said something in your response to Danielle's question about celebrating successes. I would love to see our district get more into that, really celebrating our successes. I think we have a lot of room to grow in that area. So I'm looking forward to that, but now, what was your other question?
So the other question was, what does, 1 year, 3 year, what does success look like in terms of, look at where we're at now. What is that? What would that success look like in a year from now because of your hiring the superintendent and what we'll do this next year? And then in 3 years, recognizing that there's no silver bullet, there's all kinds of things to make things happen. But what would be a noticeable success that you could really shout out, in a year or in 3 years?
I would say, we've talked as a board over the first year of anyone coming in, recognizing that they're going to be doing a lot of learning and a lot of listening. So, I don't think that there is mountain moving in year one. I think it's
start there today, you're walking into a much better spot. But all of that should build to the singular most important thing, which is academic achievement in the district. And so I think when you talk about 3 years out, measure progress, get that United Way thermometer out and say, clearly I think where we struggled a little bit is where do we intend to be and how are we progressing to that mark with regular updates, right? And define, measure, hey, are we off track? Great. What are we doing to get back to that spot, right? And so that's what I would say.
And I so appreciate it because you're validating what my assessment is a little bit in terms of what I, in terms of what I look with my years of experience in terms of where you're at. I mean, it's clearly, I drove around and saw your facilities today and what a beautiful area. And then I'm looking in terms of how you're rated, in terms of your academics, and I'm thinking, this is a highly desirable area. You're passing bond issues, and everybody always will say they're concerned about other schools, but they like their school. But the bottom line is academics, and I think we lost that, and I think what we've lost supporting the teacher in the classroom in many ways, and everything that goes with it. So I think that really is a critical point. And then the metrics. You don't wait to do you have formative assessments and summative assessments. The end of the year assessment, it's like doing an autopsy. You're looking at data where those kids are now moving on.
Yeah. And again, success breeds success, right? And
Right.
tide raising those ships. Whatever the sayings are, but we talk about retention and keeping students in the district. Well, if you're having good test scores and success and growth, some of that problem will solve itself, right, as a result of that success. Because parents want to send their kids where they see kids having a good positive learning experience. And so
As an administrator, when I left the University of Michigan, we were moving into to work for the Interim Superintendent. I was looking for the absolute best school district possible. Sometimes the best had its own problems. We had issues in openness, but our kids did extremely well.
we know that public schools in particular are losing students and enrollment is down, but we definitely are feeling that here when you look at where we were at one point to where we are today. And I think we all certainly want to change that. We can't just want to change it. You can't just tell people how great you are. It's a lot of the proof is in the pudding, right? And then you can start to see a marked change instead of incremental improvement.
And my last two questions, and I think I'm almost picking up on that, but more on maybe the student side, but it's what is your sustainability regarding students and teachers? Are you attracting, retaining, or are you losing, are you having a lot of turnover? Are you losing kids to choice?
We're an interesting district in that, is it 30%?
School choice?
Yeah, 30% of our students are school choice.
Which means you have something that's working here, safe,
But if you
Isn't that
look
how
at the
it's-
numbers, they're coming in and out. It's not a steady 30% come and stay. So there's definitely some opportunity when it comes to enrollment. But it's like a system, and I think you said this, right? If you fix certain things, that will trickle and fix the others.
So you deal with your priorities and other things fall in place.
I want to just jump back to your other question a minute. I think one of our opportunities is to be better at planning. I mean, we have the resources, we have the community, and there may be plans and they're just not being communicated, which is just as bad as not having a plan. So it comes back to your plan to fail, fail to plan, plan to fail, right?
Here's that book one, huh?
So to me, I mean, I championed not trying to toot my horn, right, but this is a passion project for me, is the planning, champion the strategic plan, and I think we still have opportunities to be better at, we brought in a service and we took our first stab at it, and now we're fine tuning it, but getting the measurements back, and to Danielle's point, the accountability to be able to say, are we making the progress? And be clear to the board, be clear to our community. We don't need to hide anything. We can say exactly where we're at and what are we doing to address where we're short and celebrate
would say I just love to have this job. In terms of I'm looking, to leave my last addition to the legacy of every district I left, I left it in a much better position. But I want to leave somebody at the top. That is, I brought back, in Traverse City, we had our state championships in hockey and football, at periods of time, but I'd love to have it academics. One of the things that was the most excitement for was when I was at Traverse City and we were hosting, I don't remember what state or regional robotics competition. That gymnasium was packed, there's mascots there, and it's all academics. We had a STEM program too, a self-contained STEM program in one of our high schools. And they would come and exhibit their projects, and it was the same thing to see that grow, in terms of where we're celebrating the academic accomplishment, just like in sports. So there's so much that goes hand in hand. But I think experience is critical. I have it, in all honesty, I think education for a long time here has been at the crossroads. We're going to lose it, we're going to gain it. We're going to eat our own or whatever. I mean, it's frustrating to me. That's why I wanted to be, I wanted to take on an urban school district. I wanted to demonstrate that, no, this doesn't have to be that way. We were once champions. Now everybody's leaving to go to the suburbs. That's frustrating for me. I'm a major advocate of choice, but I'm not afraid of choice. I like choice. I want parents to be here because they know it's the best option, for that. We lost a lot of kids. We partnered closely with the parochial school in Traverse City, but they started recognizing, that they were losing some things about what we provided our kids. And a lot of that happened to be in all our AP offerings, and even though we were offering AP classes to our Catholic school, it was a good, tight partnership. But I want parents to be with us because they have a choice, and we've demonstrated that that's a choice. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here tonight with you today.
We really appreciate you taking the time as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll
Thank
be in
you.
touch. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Oh, my goodness. Well, thanks, everybody, for coming. Nice always.
Okay, moving on in our meeting, that brings us to future items for consideration. Our meetings are listed.
Thanks for coming. I thought it was a really good night, good start, so thank you for your time commitment, very much appreciate it.
And come back Thursday.
Thank you for being here. Your feedback is valuable. Can't wait to do it again Thursday.
Julie, do you have anything?
Again, thanks for being here.
And that's all I have too. It's a pleasure to